Coming up, we may be speculating on the what ifs of a Kyrie Irving trade, but there are more mechanics to this offseason for the NBA superstar to potentially find himself in another location and maybe even better circumstances to win an NBA title. We're going to break all that down right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, yes. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. DraftKings, FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants all off season long on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for the day on all those great platforms. Doug, you knew for a fact that Kyrie Irving news does not happen in one podcast episode. There's always more to discuss about it. And I thought, as you highlighted, article in The Athletic from Alex Schiffer that really expands on this offseason from a Kyrie Irving perspective, which is something that is hard or easy to get lost in the shuffle, when you think about what does it mean for Brooklyn? Well, what about what Kyrie can do?
Yeah, so Alex Schiffer does a great job covering the Nets over The Athletic all season long. Gave a breakdown. It's not too dissimilar to some of the stuff we talked about yesterday. It goes a little more granular into what some of the options are, basically based on his colleague, Shams Charania, who also works for The Athletic, who had outlined where Kyrie Irving might be interested in going / who might be interested in bringing him in. And there were three teams that were mentioned here. It's the New York Knicks, the Los Angeles Lakers, and the Los Angeles Clippers. And so he just kind of goes, and we'll go through some of these too. He kind of just goes through, what some of those teams have to offer, where, who's untouchable, where the money lays, and sort of like, would this even be palatable from the Nets situation? I think we can agree that, like, from maybe a Kyrie Irving situation, all these would be palatable. I'm not sure about the Knicks. That might be speculation, but I think that, he joining championship contenders in LA would be like up his alley. So we'll talk a little bit about it, but yeah, it's a good job of like kind of looking a little more, I think, like realistically at like what the situation here is with Kyrie. Yesterday we kind of just reacted to it. Here it's like, how likely is a situation with Kyrie leaving to occur, and then two, like how worried should the Nets be in a contract negotiation, especially if this is posturing on the side of Kyrie?
Yeah, and that's where I think it's when we talk about player option. Here is the choice or decision that Kyrie can make. This is what it looks like to walk into free agency. This is what it looks like to go into the player option, and then that's the most interesting one, I think, too. So, I mean, walk us through just those bullet points of it, because I know you have it up there in front of you. And specifically, I think maybe starting with the player option, because there's two sides to that coin. It's opt out and go to free agency and see what happens there if you're Kyrie Irving, or opt into the player option and kind of push a pause button and say, well, let's come back to the table next year when maybe I've played 70, 65 plus games, whatever it may look like, when the team has had a good year, and when we've all kind of forgotten about some of the difficulties. And then when I say, hey, max contract, max years, the Brooklyn Nets are far more likely to say yes to that and just go forward accordingly.
Yeah, so there's four options, right, as laid out. He can opt into the player option, like you said, and that he's just a net for a year, and then we just say, hey, let's kick the can down the road a year, see how this year goes, and when we get to the end of it, we'll kind of know if this is a long-term path. That's one. The two is they just go for like the max contract, right? Like that's the 5 years, and they do it 5 years, 250. Call it. It doesn't seem like Nets are interested in that piece at all, so I don't think that one is, at least for right now, on the table. The third option is just sign a lesser contract and, fewer years, more contingencies, all this other stuff. And the fourth is just Kyrie opts out and just says, hey, I'm a free agent now. But if you go through all the options, like all these are fraught with peril for both sides, right? Because depending on what the motivations are, because like except for maybe, except for maybe, as I say, a player option, but that's a risk for Kyrie because it doesn't lock in long-term money, right? So like that's a very much a risk. And later in the podcast, I have a point about where Kyrie might stand here with the Nets. I was kind of thinking about it off air. But of those 4 options, what gets detailed a little bit more is like this opt-in, and then sign and trade piece.
Yeah, and I think obviously as we talked about inside of reacting to it yesterday, that and maybe to your point, where does Kyrie stand on this? Because I guess that's really what it is. If both sides have reached this point of saying, yeah, we're too far apart on this, the opt-in sign and trade is the most functional process for both sides to end up with being satisfied. Nets getting value, obviously, we know in a trade, and then Kyrie Irving still getting his max dollars, right? Because to your point, if you opt out and go to free agency, you limit what your prospects are, how much you can make, and what it'll look like to ultimately, maximize your value, right? You're going to lose that a little bit on the open market. But we disagreed yesterday about what we think is going to be the outcome here, and I will say quickly that somewhere in that, I think in discussing yesterday, a lot of comments. It was awesome over on YouTube.
Yeah,
I,
appreciate it.
I always to come back and reiterate, I'm examining objectively about this is what's going on, and these are what the possibilities are. I very much feel like I'm going to end up in this camp of like, this dude hates Kyrie Irving. He thinks he sucks. Like, no, but this is what's going on, and you can't like. I feel like it'd be disingenuous to turn this blind eye and go, he's a great player. Let's just automatically leap to the conclusion that the Brooklyn Nets are held hostage by this scenario, and that's automatically what's going to happen. But that being the case, I do think that if these guys can't come to an arrangement, the most likely is a opt-in sign and trade as opposed to anything else that Kyrie might choose to do.
Yeah, so like let's look. We'll go through a couple of the teams. The first one, I was gonna. I feel like I want to just eliminate this team right off the bat because it just seems so unrealistic that I just don't even see how it's possible, and that's the Lakers. Like I know the Lakers get thrown into stuff because the Lakers get thrown into everything because it's LeBron and they want everybody. Here's the harsh reality with the Lakers: they have nothing in the cupboard. They gave up everything with Anthony Davis. They have no assets. They have no good contracts. Like the players that could come back in a trade, like a sign and trade, because they need to clear money for Kyrie, is like laughably bad to the point where it's only because I hate to say this, but I feel like it's only because Shams is like pretty into that organization because he's represented by Clutch, who's the same people that represent LeBron and Davis. Like, other than that, I cannot think of a single reason why they're included in this situation. The players that they could like trade, I'm just going to move through this quick because I think this, I feel bad even talking about this. Westbrook, I'll get to that one second. Carmelo Anthony, I mean, absolutely no thanks. Kendrick Nunn didn't play all year. Taylor Horton-Tucker looking a little bit overpaid and didn't play a ton last year. And real quick about the Westbrook thing. Westbrook, like someone came at me on this, was like, oh yeah, well the best thing that what Westbrook has over Kyrie is availability. I'm like, hey man, not for nothing. Westbrook's availability hurt the Lakers last year. He had like a negative almost everything last year. Negative WAR, negative VORP, like PR was in the dumpster. Like, he played all the games. You can make a very strong case that was way worse for the team. Like just being on the court doesn't make it like more valuable. So I need to just, are you with me with this one? I want to move past the Lakers right away. Cause like if there's just no way, who would ever do this? He makes more money and he's way worse.
No, and we're going to get into on the other side some of these other more interesting trade opportunities. To your point, the only mechanics of this, and we saw this in the comments too, anyone that even throws out the idea of, oh, well, Anthony Davis, like that's not what this is. No. This is $47 million player option for Russell Westbrook. That helps the money situation. You deal with that for a year and then you move him off the books. Like that's what it would be for the Brooklyn Nets. You get a couple of assets in the draft, obviously. And
no, they wouldn't. No, but they wouldn't get any. Here's the thing: they wouldn't get any assets in that. The Lakers have no assets. Like they
can get picks from them in later rounds. They can get them in later years, 26, 27, 2026, 2027. It's going to be down the road, by the way, and it's worth clarifying. They're going to have to go a couple of years down the road before they see that turnaround. You can look at I think they have the one from Chicago, maybe a second round pick in there somewhere. Sorry, from Memphis. You can look at that one or some later 3 or 4 years from now, first round picks to your point. They are the most limited. They're in the same boat as the Nets. They gave up a lot of assets. They brought in a lot of talent. They have a ton of money on the books and they don't have anybody that's locked in long-term. So no, it's a bad option. Yes, I would be disgusted by having Russell Westbrook even for a year on this team. We need not go any deeper on this one. That is, while it's being talked about, would be probably the worst possible outcome from a Brooklyn Nets standpoint.
I guess the only upside is he's just coming off the books in 1 year. I don't know. That's like the
That's the
only thing.
benefit.
That's the only thing I can think of. It's like off the books in 1 year, and we'll see what happens. All right, we're going to talk more about this in a second. Got some more thoughts. I do have a Kyrie thought, and it's not just what he posted on Twitter, which is hilariously, know who could ever figure out what it means. But we'll talk about that in a second. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Look, some of these other daily fantasy operators, you got to put salaries in there. You're up against a bunch of sharks that are putting in thousands of lineups. It's very, very difficult. Not on Prize Picks. Prize Picks is just you versus the Prize Pick numbers. You're just going over, under on a bunch of different stats. Obviously, we're finished up with NBA right now. You go over to MLB. You want to get some home runs, RBIs, runs, go over pitchers, strikeouts. That's a big one over on Prize Picks. You put 2 to 5 players together. You go through over, under. You can mix and match sports too. They got hockey. They got really, wait till football season gets going too. Prize Picks really crushes it there. But you get 2 to 5 players. You go over, under on their projections. You can do it in under 60 seconds. It's super easy, and you can win up to 10 times on any entry. Prize Picks, like I said, daily fantasy made easy. It's really just kind of the future of what we're looking for and trying to get some action in on some of these sports. Prize Picks has an exclusive no-brainer of an offer for all of our users. You can get $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Picks entry scores a single point. You have to use the promo code NBA. So we can still use the code NBA. Exclusive offer for all Locked On fans. Sign up today and use the code NBA. $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Picks entry scores a single point. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy.
All right, hold the Kyrie thought, maybe that Twitter comment, along with, because there is that scenario of like, what is best for Kyrie Irving here? Let's get to that in a minute. There's the other two teams you said. It's the Clippers and it's the Knicks. We talked very quickly yesterday about the Knicks scenario, and I just did want to walk down that, because again, I'll do one thing first. A lot of people were saying, sure, if the Knicks want him, why not? We'll take RJ Barrett, and you'll give us some other thing, some picks here, and it's again. Any team, including the Knicks, if they're making a move for this, it's because they want to pair them with the young, exciting, quality talent that they have on their roster. So you can take your mind away from the RJ Barrett one. I know. It's like, and I feel like, and again, this is what happens when you're on the Nets side of it looking out. You go, oh, yeah, well, I see a lot of things I like over there.
Yeah, we'll just take all your best stuff. How about you send all your best stuff, and we'll send the guy who doesn't want to be here. Like, so that seems pretty fair, right?
Exactly. Now, what is interesting from a Knicks perspective is they do have a lot of contracts that can match up here, and they have the 11th overall pick, obviously, on Thursday night. So they're like, I think that there is a lot of interesting flexibility. The Knicks are talked about. They want to try to maybe move up the board if they can. They want to have a pure point guard. I do think that Kyrie Irving makes a ton of sense for what the Knicks need, and depending on what happens at 11, maybe there's another player for the Brooklyn Nets to look at and to bring into this team, combined with the Evan Fourniers and even a Kemba Walker, these kind of guys, along with some other draft capital. I asked you this yesterday, if you think, would you dismiss it because it's the Knicks? They already saw it. They're willing to trade, like with Philadelphia. This one, I wouldn't be shocked if it had some legs. And then listen, I'll give you the extra piece that it obviously keeps Kyrie close to home, which would matter to him. Does this feel like the most viable out of these three teams?
I mean, I guess, but that's like not really saying much. No
percentages needed, just the most viable.
I don't think it's the most viable. I think the Clippers, who we'll get to in a second, are probably the most viable. And so I don't think the Knicks are. I think the Clippers are more. I think the Knicks just have some of the same problems, like not as bad as the Lakers, but it's like sort of as bad. Like they have the Kemba Walker contract they can send. No thanks. Like he was benched for the Knicks last year because he might just be toast. I mean, it's a shame. It's like an injury thing. Like he just kind of fell off a cliff here, the knees and everything else. But no thanks on the Kemba Walker thing. And then there are other contracts like we got into shortly yesterday. Alec Burks, Fournier. I didn't mention Reddish, but he was buried too. That might have been a Thibodeau thing. Their name Julius Randle is thrown out here. I have no interest in that at all for the money. So okay. I'll say one thing. I'll just pause on Julius Randle briefly. And this is actually what from yesterday was, hey, these are the names that are being talked about. You mentioned some of these lower level guys and Kemba Walker and players that don't really pique your interest. Now, Julius Randle would at least pique your interest from what he is, right? He's younger and he has some value. And this is, I think, the back and forth that you would see in this or any scenario of, hey, this is what we'll give you. We'll give you Westbrook. Listen, we can't take Westbrook. But, with the Knicks, hey, listen, we'll give you players X. And you go,
well, at least Julius Randle needs to be in this conversation. I'm not saying that Julius Randle blows my skirt up, but what I will say is there are versions. It's like, why is Julius Randle looked bad, or what has he struggled with? It's like, you don't want him to be your number one or anything close to that. So what does a Julius Randle look like playing around a Kevin Durant and other versions of the Nets? And Ben Simmons, like, I can see how all of a sudden Julius Randle's role looks different and is more enticing on the Brooklyn Nets than it may currently have been on the Knicks. Doesn't mean I love him, but I certainly would be. I'd be saying, hey, I'll take that at whatever it is, 23 million a year over the next 4 years. Like, I'll still take it. And this is one of those catch a falling star and see if you reclaim his value, a la Ben Simmons. He's not going to be here later. Maybe you still find value and you're able to utilize him down the road.
I don't know, man. Almost $30 million a year for Julius Randle in 25, 26. I'd rather just let Kyrie walk. Hitching yourself to that salary. I mean, maybe it's a little tradable for something else and you piece other stuff together.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
To me, Randall's like 2020-21 season is looking more like the outlier than the rule. Like, he shot 40% from three. He was right back down to 31%, which is much closer to his career averages this year. Like, the minutes increased this. No, I guess they were about the same. The points fell off this season. I know the usage dropped a little bit because RJ Barrett got a little bit more into the offense. He's just like not the kind of player. Like, he's a fine player, but if you're a championship level, honestly, even like a deep playoff team, like, I just don't see how Julius Randle fits. I get what you're saying. And the contract isn't, like, I guess, horrendous on the money because it's in the mid-20s, but it's just so unenticing. And really the length on it too. It would just hamstring you for so many years. Like, you'd have to have him just around. You'd have to have your offense do certain stuff around them. I don't know.
I will say, in the same way that the 47 million that comes off the book in 1 year is too brutal to take Westbrook, the 4 years on Julius Randle makes it hard because you're just looking forward and saying, yeah, but what is this eventually, right? And it is about getting
I think I'm just like off the cuff. I think I'd rather do the 47 and just be done with Westbrook. I
was gonna say the bad scenario of that, but at least a year from now, you know that money is pure and clear, right? So let's flip it over though to the Clippers here though, because I'm curious what you would construct that would be successful for the Nets.
Okay, so the Clippers do have at least like functional pieces that you can sort of see, like squint and see it in terms of like a Norman Powell, a Luke Kennard, guys who can space the floor, who can defend. I mean, Powell, neither of them are like great defenders, but like they can at least knock down threes. Powell can definitely get to the rim. Like, he would offer you some secondary scoring options. Got through it. And then, like, you know, to make the money work, like a Marcus Morris, Terrence Mann was thrown in here as maybe a younger up-and-comer. I think other people might be a little higher on him than I am, but you could probably still dream on it. Like, there's enough little pieces there to say, like, hey, you get a little younger with one guy, you equal out the money with another guy who can probably play real minutes for you in Morris. And then, like, Powell could probably play, if he's like your fourth best player, maybe you're not the worst team in the world, right? Like, it's something like that. That scenario seems much more palatable to me. Like, everyone's contract is pretty reasonable. And so none of the names probably are as flashy as like Julius Randle or Russell Westbrook or whatever, but it's almost better in that way because they're all on pretty reasonable money. And if it wasn't working, like, all those pieces are probably tradable in their own right as like one-offs, right? So you could actually begin recouping other pieces if it didn't go correctly. Like, that stuff, like piling those players together, makes a little bit more sense to me than the other ones, just because I don't know, I could divide up my ability to maybe have it all work out in the end. Whereas, like, I'm pretty sure with the other guys, it's just not going to work.
Well, it's one of those funny things too, because going back to the Knicks one with Evan Fournier, and you think about contract and also age. When you mention a guy like Kennard, all of a sudden you look at the Nets and you know you have Joe Harris with that contract and where his age is, and you know that you only have Seth Curry, at least in theory, for the short term, and he's a little bit older. So from a short term, long term, right? Add in a talent, 25 years old. Well, you can see the world now and beyond where this player is someone that you can utilize on this roster going forward. So yeah, no, that's a really strong case. That's a really strong case to say, like, the money's not terrible. You're not overly committed long term. They're going to give you nothing back when it comes to draft capital. And then maybe there's a little bit of that, which I think does tie in here before we turn over to Kyrie Irving, is the decision-making process in this scenario would be, do we want as much draft capital as possible to reform this team, admitting that, well, without Kyrie, we're taking a big step back and this window is going to shrink for Kevin Durant, et cetera, or Do we want the talent around him right now and Ben Simmons to say we can still be competitive and on a deep run? And if that's the version of it, I probably, the Clippers are probably the team you look to and go, yeah, we can get this done and still come back with a quality team immediately this season.
Right. And it still would be worse because 4 quarters
Oh,
definitely typically do not equal a dollar in these scenarios, right? So you want to keep the dollar whenever you have it. And Kyrie is the dollar. And, trying to get equal value with a bunch of change almost never works. But if it's just a lost cause and nothing else can be
right,
done because you're
right.
not going to reset. By the way, and let's just stipulate, I'm going to get into some other stuff here in a sec, but just to stipulate here, this is all in the scenario of like, it's irreparable. Like
Yes.
we're not coming back from it. Like they're not going to get the contract done. Like this is, I think I would just hope that's clear from what we're all been saying. These are all scenarios like, hey, we need to break this glass because it's an absolute emergency. Like, because nothing else is working and the fire spreading. Like this is this kind of situation. All right. Got a couple more comments. Got a actually pretty interesting comment from Jake Fisher. And I have a thought that I want to run by you around Kyrie Irving here. He'll want your opinion. Did not throw this out to Adam pre-show, but seeing what his opinion on it is here in a second. First, this episode is brought to you by our friends over at Rock Auto. You got to save time and money when you're using Rock Auto because there's so many makes and models of cars out there, and forget about it. Once you put all the makes and models and then you combine it with the parts, I mean, that's like a number that I can't even calculate. It's like it goes well off beyond the page. Rock Auto has it all for you. Easy drop-down menu to search by make and model for your car, and you're going to get a better price than anything going on at those local chain places. I can't even say it. I can't even walk into those places anymore because I know I'm not getting a price anywhere close to what I'm going to get over at Rock Auto. You go to rockauto.com right now. You see all the parts available for your car or truck, right? Locked On. And how did you hear about us? Box, though, they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car or truck will ever need. rockauto.com.
Okay, so yeah, and I think you mentioned it there on the back end of this is what I was saying at the top. When information comes out, you cast your mind about what it could potentially look like. If I want to walk into the offseason, what I want to say is Ben Simmons is 100% healthy, Kyrie Irving is fully committed, and the Brooklyn Nets are looking to win championships with Kevin Durant over the next couple of years. But things aren't perfect, so you have to be willing to investigate it. Kyrie Irving had his own I don't know, had his own comments to add into the saucepan here. And then you have a question you want to throw my way.
Well, yeah, it's so funny. He just posted a picture of Brother Mazone from The Wire. I don't know what the point of that was. Often with these Kyrie things, there's seem to be like a great point about it, but maybe there's something floating around there that makes it make sense. But I mean, Brother Mazone was like the guy who was brought in to take care of the rival groups in The Wire. So whatever you want to think it is, that was his comment about it. Jake Fisher from Bleacher Report, who's very, very dialed in, did have a quick article that came out that was just kind of laying some of the groundwork for the Shams stuff that, following up on his own reporting. He didn't go too deep into it, but just as a note about it, because it's worth throwing out there, that said that the conversations were still expected to keep going between the two sides. They're apart on the parts that we thought they were, the time, the money, right? Like that's not that hard to figure out. We kind of didn't need to have that reported to know that those are the sticking points. But I will say he painted a picture that was much more sort of collegial than like this thing's on death's doorstep. It was like, hey, it's going to be fluid. We're going to keep talking. Let's see what's going on. His take on it wasn't as close to like we're all shutting the door and walking away. So just throwing it out there. It's like he didn't have any other kind of big piece from that. Here's my thought about Kyrie that I want to run by you. Do you think there's a part of Kyrie who, when he looks at this situation, so we've come at this, I think, a lot from the Nets situation where we've said, we need you to be more you. I'm speaking as if I'm the Nets. We need you to be more reliable.
I can be, Doug.
We need more reliability. We need more assurances that you're going to play. We need these things from you, like, right? Like you're a risk. Okay. And and I think we've mostly talked about the situation from that standpoint of like what the Nets. Is there a world, though, and could it be correct, where Kyrie Irving looks at this situation and says, I need to be more reliable. You need to back me up more. You didn't back me up at all during the COVID thing last year. I could have played half the season. You chose for me not to. Like, you sent me home and never got back. You didn't lobby City Hall hard enough because they had a rule that didn't make sense where visiting players could still come in and play and I couldn't. Like, Do you think there's a world where Kyrie looks at this situation and again, like maybe rightfully so, and says, I'm unreliable? You didn't back me up at all. And it was only when things got so bad during the COVID stuff in the middle of the winter that you were willing to like sort of make a case. And that was not because of me at all. It's because like you were in trouble, right? Like, do you think Kyrie could look at the situation like that? Because I was thinking more about it and I was like, I think there's a world where he could view this situation and be like, man, why am I the unreliable one in last year's scenario when there was lots of situations that could have had me playing a lot of the season that would have made this a lot better, and but you chose for it not to happen.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's fair. It's funny. I was having these thoughts just around the offseason in general and Kyrie Irving's decision making process of saying, I'm a max player in the league. That's my talent. That's what I deserve. It has impacts if I don't go for the max on other players in the league, by the way, former vice president to the NBA Players Association, right? Like he has reasonable, a reasonable thought process of saying why it matters for me to look at this certain way. Now, specifically this past year, do I think Kyrie can say, I didn't see this coming? Nobody saw this coming. And then when it happened, to your point, the Nets could have done things a lot differently or in a more supportive way around Kyrie. Is it reasonable for him to think that? Sure. Is it season and make the case about this is a one fluke scenario that I went through and you guys weren't there for me? No. And that's where I think it falls down a little bit and maybe Kyrie gets lost in the, or doesn't see his entire track record necessarily in that sense, right? He has a history, not about personal, about basketball related, where he wants to be, how he wants to be treated, etc. All of those things, I think, influenced the way the Brooklyn Nets made their decisions. I'm not saying they were all right. There was a ton of bad decisions made on the Brooklyn Nets management side. So, yeah, maybe. I guess to answer you, I know we didn't talk about this beforehand. It's like, can I see the scenario where the Brooklyn Nets are like, dude, you've been so unreliable since we signed you, like in totality. And Kyrie's like, guys, why weren't you there for me when I needed you most? And somewhere in between all of that, by the way, is Kevin Durant and being the best player on the team and what his role is as far as what he is communicating or stepping back from the table and saying, however you guys sort it out, you guys sort it out. It's a fascinating question. And honestly, I'm not hedging or sitting on the fence. I don't have the ultimate answer to it, I don't think, but it's reasonable to have it out there for what each side could be thinking or feeling on it.
Yeah, look, that's something I just made up too. Like this is not coming from anywhere, but I was just thinking about like, we've always just thought about this, I think from the net side of things of like, especially maybe the front office side of things, and, their view of how the contract negotiations could be shaping up. But I'm just wondering sometimes mostly was stemmed from what I was wondering of what Kyrie Irving was countering with. Right. Like, cause like, and that's where I thought about it. I was like, if I was him, my counter, having done some negotiations, my counter would have been, hey, half of that was on you. Like half of the situation was on you. I get that, like, we ran bad here in terms of like what city put this rule into effect. I was prepared to play the whole time. I cannot be faulted for that. Like, and I'm begging to play I'm begging to play all the games. I guess it's unprecedented. And by the way, it really helps his case if he were to say that, because they ended up doing just that, right? The fact that they ended up doing it in the end is like, would only help his case in making that point, because it's like, what do you mean you couldn't? You did it, right? Like you did it. You just took you months and months to do it. And I look terrible.
No, and you're right. And and here's the two parts of it to me are, the organization. So not just Sean Marks, Joe Tsai, right? They were vocal in and around the pandemic and within the community. They were running commercials. We talked about it with, whatever. So they had a perspective, and that is a good point for Kyrie's side to say, if you had you felt a social or moral motivation for the decisions you were making when this began, that's fine. Yep. You can have that the same way that I, Kyrie Irving, have my own individual perspective that I'm bringing, right? Great. But once you say, sugar, the season's going south in a hurry and James Harden is pissed off and we're going to lose him, now we're going to pivot. Once you do that, then right, wrong, indifferent, everyone's going to look at it and go, So did you care that much about it?
Exactly.
Or was
Exactly.
it
That would be the first thing.
motivated by or premeditated by other things that have bothered you over the course of Kyrie Irving's tenure? So it's a really fair scenario.
That's all I would hammer. Like if it was me doing at the table, I would hammer that over and over again about the unreliable piece. I was like, because you don't get to stand on the moral high ground of having done the right thing early on when you chose to not do this, not do that thing when it got hard for your team. Like that's it.
And I want to ask you something quick before we get out of here. But and the Brooklyn Nets side of it would be to say yes, but and by the way, people have mentioned this. It doesn't track 1-to-1, and I'm not making a personal judgment on anybody. Everybody immediately pointed to Wiggins with the Golden State Warriors, right? Because he was a part of the same scenario, and he made that choice. And guess what? Different levels of who they are in the NBA and the stature and everything else. The Brooklyn Nets are probably hammering the table and saying, we want team guys, culture guys, right? All that stuff. But that's the bottom line. Something I want to ask you later in the week is around what Kyrie might personally want to do in this scenario and what might be best for him. But we'll get back to the next time, man. There's a lot of facets to this. It'll be fascinating to see what happens next with it. And at the very least, they're talking. I don't think, to your point, it's not as desperate or as deadly as it feels, but something more than what we've gotten, than what we thought was going to happen this offseason is currently underway.
All right, we're going to get out of here. Thanks so much for all the YouTube comments. Tons. I think maybe our most comments ever on a thing. Some not so pumped about it, but whatever. It's great. Mix it up a little bit in YouTube. Especially really digging on Adam, a couple of times, which I really, really appreciate it. So make sure you go subscribe over on YouTube. Make sure you like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Free, available on all platforms.